Throughout the late 19th and into the 20th centuries, nations developed new technologies that led to the creation of ever larger ships. One of those types of ships was, of course, the battleship. Every naval power, ranging from the United Kingdom to Japan, was developing battleships. Even South American and Balan nations were caught up in creating these colossal fighting machines. However, not every battleship created or idea developed was the best. In that same vein, already existing ships in need of modernization might have problems. In today's video, we're going to look at 3 unique and some terrible battleships or Battleship Carnot designs. First up, we have a French battleship from the late 19th century, the Carnot. She was a part of a larger class dubbed the Fleet of Samples, if you could even call it a class, as they were all slightly different from each other. In the late 1880s, battleship construction had been suspended and then resumed, with the powers at B favoring the Gen Cole fleet composition that focused on smaller craft were to take from Stephen S. Roberts and French warships in the Age of Steam 1859 to 1914. During the 1880s and 1890s, all navies had to adjust to fundamental technological challenges, above all, the torpedo in France. This adjustment involved heated poems in the press and parliament by partisans of the Gen Cole, literally young school, favoring torpedo boats as a replacement for the mastodon battleships, while much of the Navy and its civilian supporters defended battleships as the only lasting form of sea power. With this in mind, on January 7, 1886, Rear Admiral A.B., the leader of the Jan Cole, became the Minister of Marine. Now he lasted until May of 1887, and for the sake of time, without delving too much into it, battleship construction continued under a new minister. Along with that, in 1887, with the renewal of the Triple Alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, there were calls for a stronger navy, and thus a rather ambitious naval building program that was to come to be in 1890, which included the building of battleships. Carnot, or Lazare Carnot, named for a figure of the French Revolution, was a part of a larger building program, as I mentioned, taking from Riro Sanguini and Michel Constantino. In the French fleet ships Strategy and Operations, 1870 to 198, the 5 ships were built in 5 different dockyards, SL arsenals, and shipyards, where the relevant construction managers introduced their own significant modifications. Charles Martel, Caro, and Jaber were laid down in 1891. Massa followed in September 1892, and Bouvet in early 1893. Since the design modifications introduced by the dockyard shipyards related to the hull and superstructure, it is difficult to understand fully their logic, the only effective need being to avoid overloading and overcome stability issues, taking into account the final result. It is safe to assume that these objectives were not reached. The 5 ships had in common only a tumble-home hull shape and the layout of the main caliber guns arranged in 4 single turrets, of which 2 were placed along the center line and 2 atherships on sponson. This disposition would allow both broadside and forward fire, even though a trend of the time was going towards line-of-ad formation of capital ships that emphasize broadside fire. The design of Carnot was effectively the same as Charles Martel, although the final designs were subject to changes from the works Cecil. A subcommittee of the French Naval General Staff, the council asked for the removal of shelters overhanging the main battery turrets, whose purpose was to provide access to the latter through the turret roof, probably something similar to the earlier ship Brennus. A distinctive feature of the design was the upper works were set well back from the curved hull sides to produce a steady gun platform, something similar to another ship that we've talked about. Got to love the tumble-home design. The ship was built into T-Leon and typical with French designs of the period. Each shipyard was subject to change the design of the ship while the ships were being built, and so changes to the engines, guns, funnels, and all sorts of changes happened while the ship was building. The characteristics of the ship as of June 25, 1897 were a 1,246-ton displacement, a draft of 7.93 m, and a complement of just under 700 men. She had the machinery for 15,000 indicated horsepower, including 2 screws, 2 vertical triple expansion engines with 4 cylinders, and could achieve 3,843 nautical miles at 11.5 knots, and a top speed of 17.8 knots. As for her armament, she had 2 305 mm guns, two 274, guns, four 65mm, guns, two quick-firing 65mm guns, 16 47mm, five quick-firing 37mm guns, three quick-firing 30mm revolving cannons, two submerged torpedo tubes, and two above. Water torpedo tubes armor was interesting. Being comprised of steel, the belt armor was 450 millimeters at the thickest point. The guns had 370 millimeters and 320 millimeters of armor, while the deck had 70 millimeters at the thickest, and the conning tower had 230 millimeters. Carrao entered service in 1897 and was certainly an interesting-looking ship with a large number of portholes that were eventually filled in due to the risk of flooding. Taking from Roberts, again, static machinery trials were completed on January 3, 1896. But underway trials were delayed until the hull was ready. It then became clear that the ship was overweight, a very common theme for this class, and questionable stability in the bridge work, and military masts were subsequently reduced, the foremast being lightened, and the after-military mast being removed altogether and replaced with a light pole. The designed light armament of four 65mm quick-firing guns and the 4.5 superstructures, 847mm quick-firing guns in the main bridge and in the tops, and 8 37mm revolving cannons was also altered upon commissioning. The ship was originally fit with facilities for an admiral, as she was going to be a flagship. Still, those were directed to be removed shortly after. But interestingly enough, once the observation post around the base of the forest was removed, the ship steered significantly better, that being removed in 1905. During gunnery trials, after a decade in service, it was found that excessive motion during the recoil was noted in the forward 305mm turret. This was traced to a weakness in the foundation of the lower part of the ship. Further examination and repairs in 1908 showed that rivets of the turret and other structures were loose, and others were missing entirely. Repairs were completed in 1909, and the ship was eventually laid up and scrapped in 1922. She was old, outdated, and quite frankly, a bad ship. So, to sum up the problems, she was overweight, had stability issues, had problems firing her. All right? Main battery, and was missing pieces or parts not installed correctly. I think one last thing from Staglini and Constantino sums up with the problems with the ships. Although built more rapidly than the pre-dreadnoughts, completed in the previous decade, Charles, Martel, Caro, Chauber, Msana, and Bouvet spent a long time on the slipways. The first three were completed by 1897, and the last two followed in June 1898. The French procedure for ordering new construction was so convoluted that men of war, especially battleships, took far longer to complete than almost all major warships built by other European naval powers. Addition, lack of funds hampered placing orders for more than one ship per year. A limitation that resulted in longer construction times, forced rearrangement of the original common design in accordance to initiatives taken by individual shipyards and torpedo battleship dockyards. Next up, we have a very interesting idea from the United States. A torpedo battleship. If you've seen my video on weird Russian battleships, you'd know that nation had tried to design a torpedo battleship of their own. This idea developed a bit earlier in the United States Navy. Although battleships had carried torpedoes as early as 1875, they weren't a serious explosive risk, as demonstrated by the Spanish-American War. Still, as the technology related to the torpedo developed, and so did gun ranges, the Naval War College of the United States began to experiment in war games. They found that fleets that used the torpedo effectively, decisively won the engagement over an enemy who didn't, resulting in the General Board requesting battleships be given 1 or 2 submerged torpedo tubes, where, to quote Dr. Fredman, the next logical step was a capital ship armed primarily with torpedoes. W.L. Rogers, the later president of the Naval War College, proposed such a craft during the 1903 session of that institution. Although it was evaluated in some detail, Rogers' proposal did not progress further, probably because of advances in gunnery that extended the likely battle range well beyond 3,000 yards CS. The idea was revived 3 years later by Lieutenant Commander Frank Herman Schofield. Schofield, while serving in the Bureau of Ordnance, proposed a moderate-sized 23-knot ship that was to be impervious to shell fire, armed with 16 21-in torpedo tubes, the largest guns being 12 5-in 50 caliber guns. The weight saved on guns would go to armor, and the displacement would be around 14,000 tons. Schofield thought that a torpedo hit would probably and/or sink its target, and with increasing gun ranges, it made it very difficult for conventional battleships to use their torpedoes. And with this proposed torpedo battleship, they could close with the enemy and sow chaos in their line, and allow the big gun battleships to handle the remainder of the fleet. Not too far off from the Russian idea in war games, it was found. Two such torpedo vessels proved effective in battle, where again, taking from Dr. Fredman, so radical suggestion was of great interest, not least as an equalizer to spring a numerically superior foreign fleets. The natural test was the well-developed gaming facility at the Naval War College. The main problem was how to interpret Schofield's assumptions concerning the vulnerability of his ships. Presumably, it would have been no advantage as far as underwater damage was concerned. Now we see that even the assumption of parity would have been optimistic, as the spaces devoted to underwater torpedo tubes would have been weak points in any underwater protection system. Indeed, this was a major reason for the ultimate abandonment of the submerged torpedo tubes. However, it was a point not sensed for some years. The War College played out its games and found that the contemplated usefulness of Schofield's design depends on excessive speed, which must be considerable. The excess speed of a Schofield over the Dreadnought is only 2 knots. The assumption further includes no vessel of the enemy capable of neutralizing the Schofields, which is not a safe assumption. The British Invincible type is 2 knots faster, as a battery superior to any battleship in commission, excepting the Dreadnought. Has a torpedo armament about half as great as the Schofield, but is not so heavily armored, though they are still very well protected. The committee would go on to say that they thought Schofield's design could be a useful addition to the battle line in the right circumstances, of course. Still, they recommended more heavily armored conventional battleships over this unique torpedo design. Schofield was not convinced, and he continued to develop his ideas, eventually resubmitting his designs in 1911 for a series of tactical games. This time, battle cruisers were included in the tactical games, and any attempt by the Torpedo Battleship to close with the enemy line was met with superior gunfire. Although the torpedo had a range of 6,000 yards, now the guns could hit at twice the range. The conclusion from this game was that the Torpedo Battleship was vulnerable, especially from attacks by destroyers, and money could be more usefully spent on those and more conventional battleships. Schofield, ever the persistent man, objected to this, feeling that the games were rigged against his ships, but the battleship was not again taken up by the General Board. The torpedo battleship work was picked up by another individual, R.H. Robinson, who headed the design branch, and the study were intended for Schofield's use at Newport. They formed interesting contrast to Robinson's work on battle cruisers. Schofield still stayed involved over the coming years with the torpedo battleship, and Dr. Fredman writes in both cases, high speed and heavy armor were demanded, and in consequence, a very long hulls had to be used. This, in turn, implied unusually great bending stresses, even as here in the absence of such concentrations of weight as gun mounts. By this time, Schofield had accepted the necessity for some gun armament. One of his ideas was for the use of a single, triple, or even quadruple 14-inch turret forward. His ship would use her very considerable speed advantage to achieve a position in which she could rake a column of advancing ships. The target involved would be so large that the ship would not need to be a particularly strong gun platform to achieve. Hits hence a very large metacentric height, providing considerable security against underwater attack, would be acceptable in the summer of 1912. Using some of Robinson's studies, the torpedo battleship was made bigger in progressive alterations, displacing over 30,000 tons, and machinery for at least 27 knots, moving to 30 or 31 knots with a 14-inch gun arrangement, and as many as 46-inch guns, with a reduction of the torpedoes to 8. Some of the criticism of the design was for mounting the 14-inch guns all forward, and the weight of the machinery, as it would need to be extremely large to produce 115,000 shaft horsepower to achieve that 31-knot top speed. Although this much reduced version, in terms of torpedoes, had more prospects, as the General Board was impressed by torpedoes aboard capital ships, and with more guns, it could have been more impressive to the General Board. Still, the underwater torpedo was desired on newer, more conventional battleships. The General Board desired the battleship of 1915 to have as many as 6 broadside torpedo tubes, but compromises were made for the machinery. Once again, Dr. Fredman writes, war experience soon suggested, however, that the underwater torpedo tube might not be so good an idea. In January 1916, the Bureau of Ordnance reported that torpedoes could be fired at any speeds much beyond 16 knots. Examples of underwater damage emphasized the weakness the after-torpedo rooms represented, and in the end, they were ordered policy changed again in 1921. From the South Dakota's BB-49 class on ships would only have above-water root tubes. Early plans for battleship reconstruction also included these weapons. Not until 1924 was the elimination of all capital ship torpedo tubes seriously advocated. Although the torpedo battleship concept had been developed in the 1900s, in 1910s, and had not been seriously considered since then, this was certainly the official death blow to the concept in the United States Marat Navy. The last ship we're going to talk about is the Soviet battleship Mora, named for Jean Pilara of the French Revolution. Very interesting figure, 2-in-1 video. Anyone out there been watching long enough to remember the French Revolution videos? Anyway, Marat didn't start off life with that name. Instead, she was originally the Petropavlov's part of the 4-ship gang class. Built for the Imperial Russian Navy in the Baltic, as we're not going to get into the development of the Git class, suffice it to say with their 12 305mm guns and 4 triple turrets, a displacement of around 25,000 tons, and a top speed close to 24 knots, although they had excellent guns, they had relatively thin armor and weren't the best battleships. The battleships were originally designed to be competitive with second-generation dreadnoughts, while by the time they were being built and completed, the rest of the world had moved on to the second generation of super dreadnoughts. All of that being said, the ships were a very large leap for Russian shipbuilding. For example, they represented a far larger leap than the Lord Nelson to dreadnought in the Royal Navy, as the last Russian class built was the Andrei Press-Vasveny class, built in 1904. However, during the Great War and the subsequent Russian Civil War, they didn't do a whole lot, at least in terms of engaging other ships to take from Stephen Millen in Russian and Soviet battleships, as the Soviet states slowly recovered from the devastation of the Civil War in the 1920s. The castable-class dreadnoughts were brought back into service one by one, with one exception, the fire damage Pava. All the ships had suffered to one degree or another from neglect in the first years of the Bolshevik regime. The lack of fuel for heating proved especially serious, as it meant that the water and the pipes froze during the harsh Baltic winters, leading to leaks and bursts. During the 1920s, the ships re-entered service with minor modifications. First back in commission was the Mara X Petropavlos. She rejoined the Baltic Fleet in 1922, and according to warships of the Soviet fleet 1939 to 1945, she was in the best condition out of all the class. She was little changed from her wartime appearance, although she now had 6 76.2mm anti-aircraft guns, probably Lender. Model 1914 to 1915, 3 each on the first and fourth turrets. New superstructure was added on top of the forward conning tower, displacing the rangefinder, which was shifted to a platform on the foremast, just below the level of the top funnel. Now, Morrill would ride out most of the 1920s with these changes, but the ship and her sisters were going to need some serious work if they wanted to continue having them in service with the Red Fleet. In 1925, talks about more extensive modernizations to the ships came during the drafting of the 1926 construction program, but nothing was done immediately. 2 years later, a committee headed by the Navy's Technical Administration considered modernization an urgent necessity. The fears of the committee boiled down to the ships' inadequacies of their 35mm guns, armor, engine plant, and well, almost everything about the ships really. They were old and poorly taken care of. The committee figured that to do a complete overhaul and modernization of the ships was going to cost around 40 million rubles per ship. And with trying to establish the Soviet state, famine, and other such problems, finding the money for the Navy was going to be a bit of a struggle. So, members of the Scientific Technical Committee worked out minimal and maximum conversion plans. The most serious problem faced by naval architects was the lack of blast-free above-deck space. The linear arrangements of the main battery turrets and their requisite fields of fire consumed almost all the weather deck area. Unlike most foreign ships, there was no midship section free from blast that could be utilized for anti-aircraft guns, aircraft facilities, or under the circumstances, the Soviet designers came up with the following. Again, taking from a Golan, increase the armor protection of the middle deck from 25 millimeters to 76 millimeters. Convert the boilers to oil firing, increase boiler performance, allowing for the removal of 3 boilers in the forward fire room, remove cruising turbines, install chemical protection, remove 120mm battery and install stronger AA battery of 100mm and 40mm guns. Install a tripod mast supporting a command rangefinder post as well as improv gun laying mechanism. Alter forward funnel to keep new bridges clear of smoke. Install anti-torpedo bulges. Improve CA keeping by iterations to the bow. Install a catapult and 1 or 2 new seaplanes for reconnaissance and spotting. This was dubbed the big modernization and would cost more than 20 million rubles per ship, which was well beyond the economic means of the Navy. So, it was decided to go with a small modernization, of which the Paris Commune, I can't do the Russian version, was the first to undergo these in the late 1920s, having her superstructure, funnels, bow, and other parts of the ship altered, where she was made ready to go take post as the flagship for the Black Sea Fleet, being seriously damaged in the Bay of Bisque, rolling up to 38 degrees in the storm. Next up for modernization was Mora, taking from Lynn again. The Mora was the next ship to be taken in hand for modernization, and a more ambitious reconstruction was carried out. She was followed in turn by October Revolution, and once again, Paris Commune. Each reconstruction was based on the one before. The ship was brought to the Baltic Works for modernization in 1928. The work lasted 2.5 years, the ship re-entering service with the Baltic Fleet on April 8th. 1931, the most obvious change in her reconstruction was the elaboration of the forest superstructure, which was required for the new fire control gear, at the top of the tubular tower forest. 332 meters above the waterline was the KDP-6 command rangefinder post. This featured 2 6-meter Zeiss rangefinders, this being somewhat similar to the British DCT. Other platforms around the forest and conning tower supported the control equipment for that. Secondary battery and searchlights. The limited space available meant that the new superstructure was relatively cramped and very close to the forward funnel. So following the Paris Commune's earlier refit, the funnel was raised 2 meters and angled back. The after superstructure was somewhat modified, but nothing to the degree of the forward part. The Soviets did order seaplanes from Germany being carried at top the 3rd turret. However, as there was no domestically produced catapult yet available, the aircraft would be launched and recovered from the water. The aircraft were rarely carried or used. The main guns were given a modest overhaul. The 305mm guns were replaced, along with the machinery and electrical equipment. The secondary battery was unchanged, but more anti-aircraft guns were added, as well, these being Maxim machine guns and 76.2mm guns. Machinery was also improved, with the addition of oil-firing Euro boilers. The greater steam productivity of oil firing made it possible to remove 3 boilers from the forward fire room, the space vacated being used for anti-aircraft ammunition stowage and other posts like damage control center, radio room, and even a hydrophone room. The changes also made it possible to make the ship more watertight, sealing hatches and doors for moving coal. The cruising turbines were also removed, which simplified the engine plant. Other alterations to the ship were made, especially in light of the Paris Commune experience in the Bay of Bisque, but Mora was not fit with anti-torpedo bulges, eventually completing her transformation in 1931, where you might be asking yourself, all these changes seem pretty good, how could this go poorly? Well, it just will. We'll have to wait and see, though. McLaughlin writes, the Transformer Raw underwent trials in 1931, at which time her metacentric height was 1.93 meters, at her full load displacement of 2,890 tons, compared to the original design's 1.76 meters. The fact that her initial stability increased as a result of her modernization was probably because her fuel was now oil stored in the double bottom rather than coal in the side bunkers up in the ship. However, an unhappy discovery was made during these trials. At some speeds, the tubular mass began to vibrate, interfering with effective fire control. Increasing its rigidity would have required substantial reconstruction, so shock absorbers were fitted to the optical instruments to minimize vibrations. Various minor modifications were made to the ship throughout the coming years. Still, by the 1940s, it was clear that Mora's modernization was not satisfactory, especially compared to the October Revolution. So another reconstruction was planned, and hopefully find a way for the mast and superstructure to not vibrate so violently. Still, it would never come to fruition due to the Second World War. She was sunk in September 1941 and was never fully repaired, where in this photo it's pretty interesting to see what remained of the ship. The conversion wasn't an outright terrible idea, certainly an improvement over her original condition. But that vibration was a serious problem and made using the new equipment difficult, coupled with the fact that the Git class weren't the best battleships, and by the 1940s very old. It culminated in a bad situation for the battleship. The ships on this list just scratch the surface of ideas, and are unique conversions for battleships in the future. I plan on covering more of them, especially those conversions, something like USS Miss Mississippi in a role following the Second World War. Hopefully you found this look at the possibly terrible or odd battleships interesting. I always love looking at battleships, and I think this is a good way for me to do so. Anyway, please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, my friends, have a great week.